All right, I'm going to invite our speakers to come up and take a seat up here and introduce them as they go. Here's Kelley Gulley from the Arthur M. Blank Foundation. We have Veronica Olazabal from the BHP Foundation. Kathleen Shaw with the Community Foundation of Northeast Florida. Today is going to be an experiment in the interactive. Are you ready? You are required to have your phone out. So now I can't tell if you're actually doing what I'm asking you to do, if you're like checking your emails or what. So you have full permission to have your phones out. So while people are doing that we're going to be doing some polling live via Poll EV, as well as some interactive polling in person. But we're here today to talk about the funder perspectives and how funders can do a better job at listening. I serve as the managing director of Fund for Shared Insight. We're a national funder collaborative, and our aim is to help foundations, funders, listen to the people who are most impacted by systemic racism, structural inequities, and to have them be heard, and for us to act on what they hear so that they can be better off in ways they define for themselves. And we heard a little bit about what that looks like yesterday from a number of the speakers and the various plenaries, and I'm so grateful for those perspectives that were shared yesterday. One of the many ways that we're trying to do this in terms of influencing the funders in the field is by using these 8 categories that are in something we call the Funder Action Menu. It's on our website. It's a live tool that's on our website. We're constantly trying to update it, but we just identified these 8 different categories of how funders can listen better to their nonprofit partners, but even more specifically, listen to people and communities that are at the heart of their work. So with these 8 different categories, we have examples from funders just from conversations we've been having, and we'll be probably adding to them from our conversation today. And if you know of other examples of funders, or you're a funder yourself here in the audience, who have examples of how you're doing some of these things, we would love to feature you. So many of the funders are asking, like, what are our peers doing? Give me an example of language people are using. How much are people paying stakeholders in the community to speak at our events? So they're very specific nuts and bolts pieces. We're trying to give people tools in funding institutions about how better to listen to people in communities. So with this, what I want you to do is go to Poll EV. So you'll see up there at the top, pollev.com/FBL524, or you can text. Oh, I feel like one of these ads. Or text FBL524 to 22333, and you can enter in your responses. So the question is, how can funders promote listening? Which are the ways you would like to dive more into this session? So this is like a live thing. So we have these 3 perspectives from different funders, and depending on your responses, A through H, and we have our virtual folks participating as well. We're getting some live results here. Let's see, let's take a look. So far, it looks like talking about feedback and application and reporting is high. Convening funders and nonprofits to listen together is high. Love it, having all these results changing in real time here. This one's a little hard because it says incorporate listening into other areas of operation, so it's hard to know what those are. Can everyone see all the categories? You all should probably see them on your phone as you're voting. Okay, we're still a couple more minutes. Put your hand up if you're not done yet. Oh, okay. Oh, a couple people, keep working. Probably I should have had the people who were done raise their hand because I just interrupted you from finishing your task here. Just to give a little more visibility to this last category, incorporate listening into other areas of foundation operations would be things like hiring staff, recruiting board members with lived expertise. So those are some examples of other things that foundations can do to bring in the voices and perspectives of people and communities. All right, how about hands up who's done? Done? Okay, we have a few more people still working on this. All right, I'm just going to say to our panelists here, just watch these things because we had them do a lot of work. They had to write up their responses to all of these categories, not knowing which ones they would be asked about. Okay, so I'm going to invite you now, as some of you are finishing voting, I'd just like 2 or 3 people here in the audience to comment on A. So talk about feedback and application reporting process. Is there a specific aspect to that that you would like to hear more about? Is there anyone that would like to speak to any of these other categories? A specific question that you would like us to make sure that the panelists answer. Just want to make sure we're responding to your needs here, getting real live feedback. Anything more specific? You raise your hand. Oh, we have a hand here. Wait for the mic to come around. And state your name and your organization you're with, too, please.
Good morning. My name is Tarika Young, and I'm with Kids Hope Alliance, and we serve as a funder. So my question is, if you include it in the application and reporting processes, how do you measure it? What information or what do you ask for them to show as evidence that they've completed it?
In terms of listening?
Correct.
Okay. All right, keep that question in mind. Any other specific, more specific question having to do any of these categories? Eliza, anyone from the virtual? Okay, all right, so we're going to start delving into these questions. So it looks like number 1 would be talk about feedback and application reporting processes. So I'm going to ask that question specifically of our panelists. Do you have specific examples you'd like to share about how you're asking about feedback from grantees and people in community? So be clear about which category you're talking about. And then let's be sure to get to this question about how are you actually measuring whether or not they're doing that. All right. Kelley.
Can you hear me? Ooh. I don't know if I need this mic. I'm going to hold it way down. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I have to speak from my experience when I was at the James Irvine Foundation. I just joined the Arthur M. Blank Family Foundation in July. But when I was at Irvine, we got feedback from grantees that the applications were taking too long, that they were spending too much time on reporting, and they were wondering whether or not we were even reading those reports. Don't hold your hand
Sometimes
up.
foundations don't read the reports?
Hypothetical. But they wondered because, sometimes they would hear from a program officer and sometimes they wouldn't after they have, burnt the midnight hour to get those reports in. And so one of the things that our team did, I was leading the Better Careers Initiative at Irvine at the time, was we just had a conversation about what is it that we are asking for that we can't get in a conversation midway through those grants. So if it's a 2-year grant and there's a mid-year report or midway through the 2-year grant report, how about we ask them to upload their financials, but how about we use our conversation with them as the report? And so they gave us feedback about what was taking so long, and then we kind of put it on ourselves to have a conversation, which allowed us to then have to put the information into our system ourselves in a template that we created, but also it doubled as helping us to dive deeper into relationship with grantees and for them to hear and see that we heard them and responded in that way. Now, that is something that we were doing right before I left. So how it's being measured, how it's working, it'd be a great question to go back and ask, because if we then didn't do that intentionally and diligently, then there's a missing element in that grant history from grantees. And so that's one way that we didn't ask them if they were doing feedback out in the field. We did ask them how they were listening to constituents as a part of the due diligence process, but we got feedback about our own process and responded accordingly.
Great. And Kathleen, I know you had some comments about this as well in terms of how you're listening.
Yeah, sure. I think the example we talked about the other day was First of all, we're a community foundation, so we actually have so many different types of grant making we do, and I could do a session on each of those. So I think the one you're referring to is we have a giving circle that focuses on LGBTQ organizations and individuals in the community. So in order for us to really know where should we direct our money and what are the issues that are happening in the community, we've effectively done a few different things. One, we did a broad scale, survey with the Williams Institute, brought them in and really had the community have an opportunity to give us feedback. Like, what are those things that are bubbling up in the community? What are the opportunities? What are people experiencing? And that was great, and we based our grant making approaches on that. But that was done a few years ago, right? So things change. We live in a very fluid environment, and so what we did was before we launch our grant making and make all our decisions on where that should go and what to do, we brought together a group of leaders in that community to effectively ask them what's going on and what are the projects that are happening in the community, what are the stresses, what are the exciting things that are happening. And so that was a really wonderful conversation because I learned all kinds of things, in that conversation that I wouldn't have known, had I not done that. The other thing that happened was we discovered that the people in the room, although almost all of them, their primary focus is supporting that population. There are some that are more mainstream organizations that were working, to do a better job of serving that population, is they started talking to one another. And they said, wow, this is really great. We need to talk to one another more often. And I said, that's no surprise because that happened in other fields that, we have also focused on. So right now we're working with that community to say, how can we help y'all do that? What do you need? And so I think the next step is to create a convening and be more inclusive with even more partners to help develop a way that we can support what they want to do. And so we gathered so much great information in that.
That's great. Thank you, Kathleen. And you may have noticed that Kathleen touched on several of the categories. So this is great. It's like you got a bonus. She talked a little bit about convening funders and nonprofits to listen together. She talked about how listening to the LGBT community was part of informing your grant-making practices as well as your strategy development. All great examples. It looks like, Veronica, you had something you wanted to add too. Anything specific around applications or reporting back to you? How you're asking grantees maybe to reflect how they're listening, and if you can address the question that we had over here about measuring that.
Sure. So I've got to figure that piece out too. Can you hear me? Yeah? Fantastic. And so I just transitioned to a new organization called the BHP Foundation. We are a corporate philanthropy set up in the US, and we work very globally. So we do work very far away from, for example, where Kathleen works, which is at the community level. However, clearly we've done things like done a grantee survey. In my previous life at the Rockefeller Foundation, where I was just recently, we did things like get feedback. See, and I think the key word for me is the talk about feedback in the application reporting process. We have got feedback that our reporting and our application processes are, may feel a little bit heavier. But I kind of interpreted that first block as using the reporting and the application process to actually co-create and engage with our grantees or our partners. And so at the BHP Foundation, that is very core to the way that we just work. And so about 5 years ago, which is the last time we designed and developed the application process, we co-created that design. So that touches upon the point around listening and feedback to inform strategy development. And we used it to do that because we were new to, the BHP Foundation was new to the space of philanthropy. BHP is the second, depending on the day, it might be the first, might be the second largest energy and natural resources provider in the world. and they had set up this independent philanthropy, and they wanted to set it up according to the best practices. So when they read up on the best practice says you should be listening to grantees, you should be convening them in order to design and set these processes up. So they made partnering core to their culture and to their approach. So they look at they stay very different from other philanthropies, but maybe not. They see see their partners or their grantees as partners. So we talk about our partnering approach. We talk about being fit for partnering, and part of that framework is feedback and listening. So at a principles and a cultural level, and almost at a process level, we are engaging with our partners and our grantees at all parts of our strategy and implementation design process. And as we learned about during yesterday's discussions, feedback is not a discrete moment in time. It is something that needs to be built in throughout all of our processes. And so I can affirm to you, Melinda, that yes, we do that. I think an interesting question around the measurement piece, which is also one of your buckets, but only 10% of you think that's important. I am Chief Impact and Evaluation Officer at the VHP Foundation, so I feel very passionate about making sure that when we're thinking about building our M&E frameworks or our measurement designs or our strategies, we are, number one, making sure that we're encouraging our partners, our program officers, they're our birds, to ensure that we are gathering feedback from our partners, but then also that our partners are gathering feedback from the communities that they work. And we see that from an evaluation perspective as valid data points to be making decisions upon. And so I also wear the hat of president of the American Evaluation Association this year. And one of the key points of this year is very much to diversify what is evidence. Because if we're not placing a value or we're placing a judgment on what is good quality feedback, then we're actually doing a disservice to the fact that we're gathering that feedback, that people have provided that feedback, whether it be a quantitative piece or whether it be a qualitative piece. So in principle, I would say that the woman in the green who asked that question, in principle, we should be ensuring that we are collecting information along our processes, whether it be feedback, whether it be something else, to make sure that we're making evidence-based decision-making happen in reality. But the key point to that is, what do we consider to be valid feedback? And from a philanthropic perspective, we're really diversifying and changing our position on that for many reasons that I'm happy to talk about later. I see a hand.
Those are some really good examples. I'm going to just tee up that I want to hear some challenges with this, so that we're not just talking about like how we're doing things well, but what's challenging about it. And I'll just mention from our funder action menu that's on our website at Fund for Shared Insight, we have featured a few examples specifically of like questions that funders have asked of their grantee partners or the folks that are applying to get grants. So for example, the Morris and Gwendolyn K. Fritz Foundation uses this specific language: can you explain how the population you serve is involved in the work of your organization? And or how client feedback is collected and incorporated. So that's a very specific question that they're asking now of all of their potential grantee partners. Another example is from the Moses Taylor Foundation, which is one of the 140 funders involved with Listen for Good, which is a signature initiative of Fund for Shared Insight that's building the capacity of nonprofits to listen. So they ask on their grant applications, how do you solicit feedback from your participants? Do you have a system in place to make changes to your programs based on the feedback received? So those are some specific, like, do you have a system? Yes, and maybe ask them to describe a little bit. In the case of like the 600 some nonprofits across the country that have implemented Listen for Good, they can say, we're implementing Listen for Good, which is a rigorous, systematic, ongoing data collection process of listening to people in communities that we serve. So we have several other examples that have specific wording that other funders are using. So you can just take those and incorporate them into your work. But I think what's important here is that we're not asking nonprofits information that we're then not reading and that we're not using. So to your point about how are you measuring, how are you asking, so there could be answers. For example, there are a number of nonprofits. I think I'm going to look at someone from Feedback Labs or the Irritants for Change group. There's a whole initiative through Candid called How We Listen, where we're engaging nonprofits to be able to self-describe within the Candid profile how they're listening. It's a qualitative response. It's not quantitative, but it's another way to say, like, here's how we're listening. And now we have, what's the number? Over 16,000 nonprofits are now providing, like, it's a short paragraph. It's not an ongoing systematic sort of system like Listen for Good, but it is a short qualitative answer that nonprofits can give that funders can also read on Candid in their profile to see how they're listening. So now I gave you time to think about the challenges. Can one of you or two of you speak to some of the challenges involved with asking these kinds of questions of potential applicants or asking people to report on how they're listening? Because, like, one of the things we did very early on with Candid, with How We Listen, was we piloted having people do some sort of assessment of their level of listening and the quality of it. And we basically had people say, I would just game the system. I would tell you that I'm really listening well, I'm doing all these things, even if it wasn't true. Because if it's going to boost my score on Candid, then I'll do that. So we're like, okay, let's not create a system that's going to encourage people to game the system. Is there any comments that you might have to this? Kathleen?
Yeah, I do have one. I'd say we've done so many different things, and some things work and some things don't work, and some things that work don't work all the time, right? So it's just being really flexible. We've had all kinds of questions on our report, and some people will say, everything was great, but you have to realize that they're reporting to a funder, and they're thinking, I want to get a grant the next time, and I really don't want to give bad feedback. And so I think it's really about trust building, right? The relationship. And so we have seen grantees that we gave a grant to, and we got that, y'all are the best, and we just love working with the community foundation. And that's when I know, I bet they don't trust us, because there's always room for growth, right? And so that's where it's good to have a conversation when you're really not in the grant process, and you can talk about what are the challenges, what do you wish, that we would do, how can we be more helpful, and just try to build that trusting relationship. Because once you're in the grant, I've been on both sides, so I get that, you just want to be good, and you don't want to let them know something went wrong. And so I think you have to build a relationship, and that's both ways, And so I think the onus is on us, to try to encourage that, but it's also on the nonprofit to take that risk, and do that.
Great, thanks.
I'll just jump in quickly, something that came up yesterday, as well as when we were preparing. So first, when we were preparing for this session, I seemed to be, the Debbie Downer. I was just challenge. And so when we were talking about this earlier, one of the challenges that I asked about yesterday was this issue of time. Because this work is about trust, and because it's actually quite relational. Like feedback, you can make it as scientific as you'd like, but at the end of the day, we're all gathering feedback. We're human beings, and we're interacting and engaging. And so it's really about, I was listening yesterday during yesterday's lunch panel, and it's really about the process of trust building. And so if we're thinking about that, the Center for Effective Philanthropy talks a lot about how the point of entry to a philanthropy is your program officer. So being able, as either a grantee or a partner, to be able to build a trusting relationship with your program officer is the key. It's the secret sauce. On the philanthropic side, program officers come into the role from all kinds of places. I know Kathleen mentioned she came into the philanthropy from the nonprofit side, as did I, and perhaps you did as well. And so, you get to the philanthropy and you're like, okay, what's the toolkit for being a program officer? And perhaps there is. You go to all the philanthropic players out there like Candid, but really there isn't really a 101 on building trust and building a good relationship with your program officer. That's something that you're learning along the way. And so the most critical points of feedback is the kind that happens in the moment when you are engaging with your program officer, and that could be systematic or it could be bespoke. And so it almost puts it on the onerous piece on the program officer. However, it takes time. Differentiating between what feedback you're actually going to respond to as a program officer takes time. Closing the loop on the feedback, going back to your partner or your grantee, takes time. And whether that is a reporting conversation or whether it's an application conversation or whether it's a strategic pivot conversation, so many moments in time, it takes, you're gathering feedback over and over again. And I remember, so I'll talk a little, that's the challenge in terms of the solution. And so I was thinking about this when I was at the Rockefeller Foundation, and I thought, okay, from a capacity building perspective, what if we test out building the capacity of our partner, our grantee, to be able to listen better? And we did. I'll plug in the Listen for Good grants here. We did offer this service and this resource to our partners. And the feedback that we got from our partners was, we really were excited to get this capacity support. We really were excited to have this resource, and thank you for providing that. It was in the middle of a pandemic, so you can imagine, maybe it didn't work out as well. But the feedback was, we really don't have a lot of time to be doing this work. How can we do this work? How can we check off the box? How can we build our capacity without investing the time? So yesterday when I asked the question during the panel, there's a critical element here that nobody has, and that is that we are all stretched and moving in different directions. And so if you're not building in the time to actually collect the feedback, to be specific about where that feedback is most effective and strategic, and to respond to that feedback at a cultural level, one pilot is not going to solve your feedback challenge. One project is not going to solve your feedback challenge. It's really a mindset. It's really a cultural piece, and you can build it into every one of these places. And so that's why, my last point, I really like this list. Because there's where should I start? If I'm a funder or if I'm a grantee, what should I ask for? Mm-hmm. This list of 8 really gives you a good and simple and straightforward place to start asking about where you can dedicate your time and your resources to be able to be most effective in how it is that you show up in that partner-donor relationship.
Thank you. So let's segue into that capacity building grants to improve nonprofit feedback practice, which was the second highest amount. But I also want to circle back. Did we answer your question? Yes. Okay, good, to close the loop. Yay. All right, Kelley, what do you have to say about how funders can build the capacity of their nonprofit partners to listen?
I'm going to piggyback on the challenge that was talked about and talk about, the capacity building that we're doing at the Arthur and Blank Family Foundation. One of the challenges is when you have a couple folk inside your philanthropy that are the listening champions, and that's it. Actually helping bring folks along to, what do you mean by feedback? What do you mean by listening? So at Arthur Blank, we decided, Faye Twersky is our president. She's been there for a year now. We just celebrated her 1-year anniversary. She told me to tell all her peeps, hey. She misses being here. She's a feedback champion for sure. So when she got to Arthur Blank, there was no connection to Fund for Shared Insight or the Listen for Good when we were there. She said, I want to fund organizations to participate in Listen for Good. Let's start there. And so we had myself, actually, before I joined Blank, Melinda and Valerie Throwfall, who's in the building, from Listen for Good, actually do a presentation to the Blank family staff. And it's funny, I can say it now because they're my staff. But it was like blank faces, deer in the headlights. What are they talking about? What is this? Is this something else I have to do? I don't have time for this. So when I got to the foundation and Faye said, this is going to be one of the projects you do, you know it, you can get people excited about it. We did another round of kind of an orientation with Val. We went a little bit deeper so people could understand what is the ask. What are we going to do? We're going to go ask organizations to apply to be a part of Listen for Good, and we will pay for it. And we're going to give you a $20,000 general operating grant to help you do whatever you need to do to make sure that you're able to do this in a meaningful way for your nonprofits. And so after we did that kind of second, third round, and I did a lot of kind of proselytizing inside, and this is what it is, ask questions, and sharing more information about Listen for Good, people got excited about it. But it took a process. It was a good 3 or 4 months of talking and sharing and sending out the incredible videos that Rick does for Listen for Good so people could kind of get it. And these are the program officers. These are the ones that would then say, oh, I have organizations that would be ripe for this. And so we used our team to get to those organizations. And then we did another orientation with the organizations to see if this was something they would be interested in and would want to do. But coupling it with a capacity building grant, $20,000 is not a lot of money, but if you're going to do Listen for Good and really raise feedback and quality feedback loops as a key practice in your nonprofit, somebody else, nobody has that job right now if this is new for you. And so it could mean anything, and that's why we made it, a general operating grant. Because you might need iPads, you might need to let somebody work more hours and pay for overtime, whatever that might be. Now this all started in January, so I don't have results, but we are really, really excited about it. We're gonna bring there's 19 grantees that are now funded for Listen for Good that receive those capacity building grants, and we're really excited to bring them together one time this year virtually, but then next year, towards the end of the grant period, we'll be bringing them together in person so that they can learn from each other, and we'll see how it went and how they used those funds.
And Kelley, that was something that you did when you were at Irvine too, and we were a part of that. So that's the convene funders and nonprofits to listen together. Is we have a variety of funders that have nominated or sponsored multiple nonprofit partners to participate in Listen for Good, and we've done day-long convenings so that the funder can be at the table and hearing what the nonprofits are hearing from people in communities about how they need different services and how the funder can maybe change what they're funding based on what they're hearing through the nonprofit partners, through Listen for Good as a tool to listen. And we've been doing that with a variety of funders. The Moses Taylor Foundation that I mentioned earlier, they have a funder collaborative actually in the Scranton, Wilkesboro region. They have 5 funders because it's a small community. They got them all at the table and they pooled a fund to support 5 key institutions in that area to do Listen for Good, and then have been meeting quarterly for about an hour and a half over lunch. During COVID, it was virtual, but to meet and talk about what are you hearing from the community? How can we be partnering with you? What do we need to do differently? And it was great because there were funders doing this together. So if one of the funders said, well, the feedback we're hearing from the health clinic is that people are having a hard time getting to the clinic, so they can't actually access the services, but we don't fund transportation, to which we often ask, why? Why can't it be more flexible? But okay, if you really can't be flexible, at least in this funder collaborative, there's probably another funder at the table who can fund the bus tokens so that the health funder can get the people to the clinic and to get the services and get feedback on that. So our aim at Fund for Shared Insight is for funders to change. And we know that it's a very hard process to get funders to change. Getting more champions within foundations. Shout out to the Feedback champions for both the nonprofits and the funders that are here at Feedback Labs. So delighted that we have 9 Feedback champions. We're trying to build within institutions and then trying to push from outside to get funders to change. Please join me in thanking our panelists, Kelley, Veronica, Kathleen.